Hello and a very warm welcome to the Andrew Eborn Show, where I'm joined yet again by the fabulous Philip Mantle. How are you, Philip?
Good evening, Andrew. I'm fine, thank you. Thank you very much.
Long time no see.
Yeah, where have you been?
I know, hiding. I've been hunting for these UFOs because I thought it's having inspired us last time because your book's coming out on November the 1st. So we're all going to be looking forward to that. And you gave us a guide last time to what people should be looking for and what they can do with that information and go and join groups and so on and so forth, and checklists. But there are some periods in history and some instances that have troubled people for a long time. And you're going to talk about some of those. Tell us what happened.
Well, one incident in particular we're going to look at, Andrew, happened decades ago, 1973, October the 11th to be exact. And it was nowhere in my neck of the woods, actually in a place called Pascagoula in Mississippi in the United States. It involved two men, Charles Hickson, he was age 42, he lived in Pascagoula, and his friend Calvin Parker was almost 19. This was his first day in Pascagoula. He actually lived 200 miles away, but he'd recently become engaged and he wanted a steady job. So he took a job working in the shipyard in Pascagoula. Charles Hickson was his father's friend who got him the job. So he rented a room from Charlie. So he was paying board and lodgings. That was the idea. And he was set to get married. So literally the first day at work, Calvin Parker goes to the shipyard, is a welder, does his health and safety introduction, and then set to work. On the way home that night, one of the interests both gentlemen shared, Andrew, was fishing. Now, the Pascagoula River is a huge, great river. It's not some pilly little fish pond, it's huge. And so they're looking for a fishing spot on the way home, and Charlie said, I know just the place. Calvin said, well, I've got no fishing tackle. He said, all right, you borrow some of mine. So he went home, got the fishing tackle, stopped off en route to buy some bait, and off they went. Calvin's driving. Now, this place where they turn up, Andrew, is not in the middle of nowhere. It's right next to Highway 90. There's a huge, great bridge goes over the river, plenty of traffic. So they're set up in one spot to begin with, but they're pestered by all kinds of flies. So they move. They moved to an old grain elevator that used to be there, and there's an old pier that's a bit dilapidated now. So they're fishing off the end of that. As they were driving in, Calvin noticed a no entry sign, and he mentioned that to his colleague, and they said, don't worry about it. I've been here lots of time. They passed another car that was parked, maybe a courting couple in it, So they're fishing away, and then from behind them is a blue light. Now Calvin thinks, it's the police. I knew we should not have ignored that no entry sign. We're going to spend the night in jail. So he turns around expecting to see the local police car there, but it wasn't. There was an object descending, shaped like a rugby ball, really, with two lights at one end. It didn't quite touch the floor. It hovered a couple of feet off it. And he said he calls it a door for want of a better word. This door opened out of nowhere, and the light, he said, was so intense it hurt your eyes. Reminded him of the welding lights. Blue it was, or a blue light. And then out of the light came these three figures, humanoid figures. Again, they didn't touch the ground. They literally hovered above the ground. Two grabbed hold of Charlie. One got hold of Calvin, who by this time he's petrified. And I mean that, he's absolutely terrified. He said, I felt maybe an injection or some kind of prick in my arm, and I relaxed. They took him on board this thing. Him and his colleague were separated. He said, they laid me on this, he said, I'll call it glass, I don't know what it is, but this transparent table at an angle. And this thing came down out of the ceiling. It was shaped like a pack of cards. And it just spun around me. He said, I could hear it clicking as if it was taking pictures of some kind, or I didn't know what it was. Put it back. This creature got hold of him. He said, I'm scared again. I felt another prick in my arm. They take me back, put me on the pier where I was found. And he says, I looked up and there's Charlie screaming at him. Are you all right, son? Are you all right, son? In fact, Charlie slapped him one because Calvin, unbeknown to him, was actually stood with his arms out straight like this. So he came around, terrified of what happened, and he said, "We can't." And they saw this thing depart, Andrew, gone in a flash. We can't tell anybody. We can't. Nobody will believe us. They think we're nuts. We're mad. So they get back to the car. For some reason, the passenger window is shattered. This is a brand new car as well. They get in. It wouldn't start. It took 3 or 4 goes before it would crank, as Calvin calls it in Mississippi language, to start. And off they went. And they were still debating whether to tell anybody or not. Then Charles, who'd been in the army and fought in the Korean War, said, "We must tell somebody. This could be an invasion. We don't know what's going to happen." So they found a payphone. They didn't have any money to put in it. So they ended up calling the local sheriff. They phoned the airbase first. They said, "We don't have anything to do with UFOs. Ring your local." So they phoned the police. Police said, "Stay there. We'll come and get you." First thing they did when the police got there was check them for drink. They hadn't been drinking. So they escorted them into town to the sheriff's office. Both men still petrified, Calvin more than Charlie. They interviewed them separately, and then they put both gentlemen together in one room. Now, unknown to Charlie and Calvin, in the desk next to them was a tape recorder that was playing, and the police left them to it. Left them there, I don't know, 5 minutes or so. They came back and they saw them take something out of the drawer, but they had no idea what it was. It was the tape. They played it, and you could still hear them on this tape describing what had happened, how scared they were. Calvin was even praying at one time, saying, "I've got to get home and get something for my nerves. I've got to get some sleep." Somehow they went home, they were released. The next day, the story had got out, Andrew, and they were inundated by the journalists, media from all over the place. To this day, Calvin has no idea who let the cat out of the bag. They were sent for a medical. The following day, they were sent to Keesler Air Force Base, which is the place they'd phoned to begin with, to be checked for radiation. That came out all clear, but the base personnel said, "Oh, while you're here, just come on down here and have a chat with us and tell us what you saw." And they even had a stenographer recording the conversation, and we have a transcript of that. And then one of the most, well, probably the most famous UFO researcher there's ever been is Dr. J. Allen Hynek. He was the scientific advisor on Project Blue Book. He arrives along with a colleague called Dr. James Harder, and they've interviewed both men. They listened to what has been nicknamed the secret tape. Again, Charlie and Calvin had no idea about this tape. And Hynek held a press conference and said, "These men are the genuine article. Please treat them with respect. They've had some kind of traumatic experience. We don't know what, but they have." Now, both men dealt with it differently, Andrew. Charlie was okay. He managed to handle it. Calvin went back home, 200 miles away. 3 weeks later, he was bunking with his brother in his room, and he said, "I just started shaking, Philip, and I couldn't stop. I literally could not stop. My brother took me to the hospital, and I'm sat there waiting in what they call the ER, emergency room, like everybody else." And he said, "I got fed up of waiting, so I picked the chair up and threw it against the wall." That got people's attention. So the doctor came and treated him, but he'd had a breakdown. So Calvin disappeared into the distance. He didn't want anything to do with it. But Charlie went on television. He was the biggest talk show in America at the time was the Dick Cavett Show.
Absolutely.
Charlie Hickson went on the Dick Cavett Show. Talked about. He lectured at a couple of UFO conferences. He even made a record narrating his encounter. He was written. He had thousands of people write to him, and people just turn. But Calvin hid away. Making a long story short, in 2018, I'd obtained the rights to publish a book that was written by Charles Hickson and William Mendez in 1983. And I knew Charles Hickson had passed away in 2011, but I thought Calvin was still alive. We didn't know, but I thought, wouldn't it be nice if I could get an interview with him while I'm publishing this old book? So it took me about 3 months, but I finally tracked him down, and he lives just outside of Pascagoula. And he was very polite when I spoke to him, but not very forthcoming, to say, but polite. So I sent him a couple of emails, and I explained to him, unbeknown to me, Calvin had recently been to a friend's funeral, and on the way out, they signed a book of condolence, and he signed it Calvin Parker. The people from behind him, when they saw Calvin Parker's name, they're going, you know, wink, wink, nudge, nudge. It's that UFO fella, you know. So Calvin's wife, Waynette, who'd been with him throughout this, she was the lady he was engaged to when he started all this. So why don't you write a damn book? And people, everybody will know your story. Even I don't know what happened to you, and I've been married to you all these years. So to pacify his wife, he said, okay, I'll write a book. He'd no intention of doing it. But then I came along and said, well, why don't you write a book? So he said, okay. He agreed. So together we put his book out. It's called Pascagoula, The Closest Encounter. It's the first time he's ever told the full story. So we go through it all. There's hypnosis. There's everything in it. What happened, Andrew, was Calvin did some local television. And one of those was an interview he did. And somebody put it on YouTube. And underneath, you know, most of them, you can leave a comment. Some young lady had put, my mother and father were on the opposite side of the river that night. They saw the UFO too. So that got my attention. So I contacted this lady. She gave me the telephone number of her mum and dad, Mr. and Mrs. Blair. I phoned them, I spoke to them, and yes, indeed, they were on the opposite side of the river that night. Mrs. Blair first told me the story. She says, my husband worked in the fishing industry. And we were on a pier on the other side of the river, waiting for a boat to come in. It was late. My husband was grumpy. And then she said, I don't know what time it was, but on the other side of the river, we could see this blue light. And whatever it was, she said, it was either looking for somebody or didn't know where it was going. Mr. Blair saw it. And at that point, his boat finally came in. And Mrs. Blair said, as we're walking down the pier, he's in front of me, still grumpy. She says, there was a huge splash in the water right next to me. And she says, when I look down, there's a grey man. There's a grey man in the water. He went under the water and was gone. She ran through the stuff on the boat and was gone. She spoke to Mr. Blair about it on his return home. He said, don't tell anybody. Then they saw Charlie and Calvin's story on the local news and realized it happened at the same time. Mr. Blair went on to tell us that, yes, he too had seen this grey humanoid, he said. And he said he saw whatever it was on the far bank. He said, I saw it lift off as well. But I didn't want to tell anybody, Philip. People think you're nuts. But he told us, sadly, Mr. Blair has passed away in the meantime, but he went on the record before this. Calvin also did, for example, a book signing in the town. This old boy came up, bought a book. Thank you, Mr. Parker. Oh, I saw that thing that night as well, and walked away. Now, luckily, somebody was taking photographs, and there was this gentleman with white hair. So I passed it around to a few people in the town. Said, do you know him? And one of the ladies at the library said, yeah, I know that chap. I'll see if he'll speak to you. Yeah, he will. So again, we got the telephone number, and it was a chap called Mr. Lewis Lee. And he was on the other side of the river again, but this time he was working in one of the shipyards at night. And he said, I was a crane operator. And he said, when you got in my cab, it's about 10 or 12 feet off the ground. I could see it, Philip. And he said, it's the damnedest thing I've ever seen. And he said, I couldn't take my eyes off it. He says, the only reason I stopped looking at it is because I got something on the end of my crane. And one of the guys down below is shouting, what are you doing, you know? And he said, I told my wife and family about it, but that's about it. I never told anyone else. And these are just two people, Andrew, out of a plethora of others in and around the area.
So there were witnesses who saw something similar. Now, Calvin, did he have a medical examination afterwards? Did he go along with your doctor?
Well, they went to the local hospital. Nothing turned up. They went and were checked at Keesler for radiation. Nothing turned up. However, when I set out to write this book with Calvin, I said to him, have you got any documents, photographs? He said, no, I don't. He said, our house was hit by Hurricane Katrina and we were under 12 feet of water. Everything has gone. I've no photographs of our wedding. Everything's gone. So I set about hunting for documentation, photographs, anything I could get my hands on. Now, Alan Hynek, shortly after this incident, he opened the Center for UFO Studies. So I thought, well, it's a natural to contact them. So I did, and they said, yeah, we've got a file on it. So they sent me this file. It's a big PDF file. Most of it is newspaper cuttings, to be honest, Andrew. But right in the middle of it is a one-page typed document. People of our age will remember the old typewriters. You can tell it's a typewritten one because they've actually gone over the date. They've typed the wrong date and they've gone back. It is the 12th of October. And it's a medical exam of Charlie and Calvin. And it said both men had puncture wounds about their body. Now, remember Calvin saying he felt this prick that he felt was some kind of injection. So I said, well, who else examined you? And he said, Dr. Harder, when he arrived, although he wasn't a medical doctor, you know, we stripped down to our underwear and he gave us the once over. So we're assuming it's him that's written this. And it's kind of, you know, supporting evidence, if you like, that they did have these marks about their body.
So they talked about, I was going to ask about that. So they talked about a puncture wound in this medical thing.
Yeah.
If somebody had had an anesthetic, which is what was described, then there would be something still in their bloodstream. What were the results of the blood
There was
test?
nothing. They couldn't find anything.
Couldn't find anything.
No. And again, we've contacted the hospital and the sheriff's department for any documentation. And again, we get the same story. They were also hit by Hurricane Katrina. And so certain files and things have just gone. I mean, the whole town was under, pretty much underwater. I think even the old sheriff's building, half of it was demolished when the hurricane hit.
However, lots of records were lost as a result of it.
Well, that's true. However, earlier this year, one of the police officers on duty that night, in fact, he was the police officer that took the call from Charles Hickson. And he's still alive. And he said, Philip, I must have taken over 50 calls that night of UFO reports. Right. Literally. And he said, when I went back to the station, there was even a clergyman there and other people reporting it in person. Now, he said, I've got something of interest. I said, well, what is it? He says, it's the secret tape. I actually have a copy. The sheriff at the time was a chap called Sheriff Fred Diamond back in 1973. He's deceased now, but he went on the record at the time believing these two gentlemen. This is his son. And he said, my father gave me the tape for safekeeping. And I have. So we got to hear the secret tape for the first time. There was a couple of bits online, but you couldn't hardly make it out. This is a lot clearer version. So we have that as well. It's known as the secret tape. Charlie and Calvin also went under regressive hypnosis with a world famous guy called Bud Hopkins from New York. He was renowned for his work in this area. Again, sadly, Bud's not here anymore. And I managed to obtain the cassette tapes of the recordings of Calvin's and Charlie's hypnosis sessions. And you can hear most of it. There's one or two bits that are a bit low, so I transcribed all these tapes as well. So you have the regressive hypnosis. And it's fascinating. There's one point in Calvin's encounter where he literally screams. And it's not a pleasant thing to hear a grown man scream in fright. It's not. I wasn't expecting it, but it came. So with all this evidence bundled up into a report, most of which we uncovered just in this last 2 years.
Right.
So one of the things I've said when it comes to investigations, you may come to an roadblock at some point, but don't give up. You'd be amazed. And not only that, pretty much all of the witnesses that have come forward have said, yeah, you can use my name. I'm not bothered. I saw it that night, and I don't care if anybody believes me or not.
So in terms of evidence, then, you have evidence from a number of independent witnesses saying that something happened, and their version of events, they corroborate what others might have been saying about the shape and the way that it was traveling and the lights and so on and the timing. That's all corroboration from a number of different sources.
Yes.
You also have evidence from the two people concerned that they may believe what they told people because they went through a lie detection test and they had a secret tape and so on and so forth. So they had convinced themselves that what they were saying was not a lie, a deliberate telling of an untruth, not a deliberate untelling. But we've looked in earlier episodes about sometimes people can convince them, like your mother. She was convinced when she was 12 that she saw a fairy. And you believe her, but that sort of situation. So you've got that bit of the evidence. You've got evidence of puncture wounds, which would be consistent with somebody being injected with something.
Yes.
But you have no evidence that there was any anesthetic in their bloodstream or anything else, or any operation carried out, just a puncture wound from that sort of stuff. So is there any other evidence that might support the fact, because the fact that this is what people classify as an alien abduction, and what people are always scared about is that they're there and they examine the body and put it back again, and that was it. Is that what you're saying has happened?
Well, I'm saying they had an encounter. Even Calvin to this day does not know what happened to him. He can say, I can tell you whatever I can remember. And he said, I've wrestled myself with what this may or may not be. This is what because he believes in the Bible, in God. And he says, there was a time I thought these must be demons of some kind. I didn't believe in aliens from space. There must be demons. And he went through a period of that. But he said, I have no idea. I'm just looking for the answer. I don't know what happened. All I can tell you is what I can remember. And what Charlie told him as well, because as we know, Charlie wrote his own book, so we have his testimony. Charlie was interviewed by every man and his dog at the time, so there are clips of him on television and on radio that we can reference from the time. And the two stories are very, very similar. They're not the same, but they are very similar. So there's no huge discrepancy there. They both had polygraphs. I even have a copy of Charlie's polygraph printout. I've no idea what it means, but I have a copy of it anyway.
Well, we should have in future episodes. We'll have a look at that, and we'll get some experts in.
What is interesting, what is interesting, we know from the newspaper accounts at the time, the man who did the polygraph and the company. So I wondered, is it still going? It's a long time, and so I found it online, and he's still going. It's now a detective agency of some point. So I wrote to them and I got a reply, and they said, we did it. We don't keep any paper records because all we have is the printout, and we give that to whoever's paid for it. And he said, I got a nice, very pleasant, very positive reply from them. So make of it what you will. One of the criticisms, of course, was that there is this huge motorway bridge with traffic on it. How come nobody on the bridge saw anything? Well, they did. We had a gentleman just recently, Andrew, said, I'm driving across the bridge with my wife. I see this blue light down underneath by the river, thinking something's going to crash. It was that low. And he said, I saw it for about 30 seconds. And that's a long time to view something. He says, the next day, my grandmother, I went to visit her. She lives down by the river. Didn't say anything. And she sat there, and you know what? She says, you'll never believe what I saw last night. She too saw this blue thing down by the river. So it would seem that the more we get the story out there, the more people that come
absolutely. And this very episode, people will be hopefully writing in and telling us at UFO@octopustv.com. That's UFO@octopustv.com. Do write and tell us if you were there on that fateful night, and if you yourself saw anything. And particularly interesting, because I get it that there could be a lot of witnesses who would have seen something, we're not quite sure what, but you've described the shape, you described the lights, you described the sound, maybe and they saw some figures. I'd like to know a bit more about that. The bit that's troubling me, because people can convince themselves, as we say, as you know. Your mother convinced herself she saw a fairy at the age of 12. And as you said, growing up, you were convinced that she probably didn't, but she wasn't lying, as in because she believed it. It's not an active untruth. And we made that distinction in an earlier episode. The bit which I need a bit more help with, if you like, is what happened when he was taken on this craft and looked at. Because if you have a puncture wound in your arm, it would suggest that, okay, you might have been injected, and you can tell how recently that was. But if their equipment, I'm trying to think of it logically, if their equipment was so advanced that you couldn't tell what else happened, in other words, there's no anesthetic in the blood and there's no sign of an operation or anything else, why would that equipment have punctured the skin?
Well, we're assuming that it did. We're not saying for certain that it did. All Calvin can remember is he felt these pricks on his arm and then he fell relaxed. So he's assuming that the two go together, but we can't prove that, of course. And he even told me the angle at this table that he was laid on, because he in his line of work, he's worked in construction and engineering. He's used to identifying angles. He said, I couldn't move. I was literally frozen. The only thing I said I could move was my eyes. So I'm laid on this, I'll call it a table for want of a better word, and all I could move was my eyes. I was totally frozen. He didn't see his colleague.
What did he see if his eyes were there and he was
Well, he said the strange thing was that he said the light came out of the paint. There was no light bulbs. The light came out of the wall. He calls it the paint. He don't mean paint exactly.
The wall. So in the same way as my backdrop might look like a big light, you can see the
light just emanated from the walls. And he said, I don't know where they took Charlie. I didn't see him. Charlie described something very, very similar, but not the same, but very, very similar. The creatures that they encountered were about 5 feet tall, maybe slightly more. They had long arms. They didn't have fingers. They had mittens or pincer-like appendages. Their legs never moved. They stuck together. They had no eyes, no mouth. They had like carrot-like protrusions, one out of each side and one out here. And they said their skin, if that's what it was grey, but it looked like elephant skin, all wrinkly. And both men described these pretty much exactly the same. And what is interesting, Andrew, is that you don't find this description anywhere else in the UFO literature, either before or since. And I can't find any that match in the science fiction literature. But I'm not a science fiction buff, so I don't know. I've certainly searched. I can't find anything. So they're not responding to some other kind of stimulus that I'm aware of. And their accounts are similar, but not the same. And Calvin says, I don't know what happened. He doesn't even know what time of night it happened because neither of them wore a watch.
Sure.
Calvin to this very day doesn't.
But what he does remember is his eyes, and I'm just trying to picture this. So looking at it logically, and it's much easier because you're doing it secondhand, and I know you've got all that sort of evidence. But talking to them, what we would ask is, look, if they recognize that there was a sort of glowing paint in the same way as my backdrop might, you think the paint was illuminated, but it's not. It's not a light on that sort of basis. What else did they remember? They identified the people. Did they not recognize what was happening to them? Because they were sedated. This is consistent with their story. They say they were sedated. Why were they sedated? And what was the procedure that these grey creatures, as you call them?
They didn't do anything. The only thing that happened was this thing. He said it came out of the ceiling. He said it was like the shape and size of a pack of cards.
Yeah.
It stopped next to his head and then went around underneath him, and it made a clicking noise. And he said, I don't know what it was doing, what it was supposed to do. It didn't hurt me. Charlie said something similar, but he described it as an eye-like device. But again, it went around his body and said as if it was checking for something, looking for something, or taking pictures, but they have no idea. They weren't touched, they weren't examined.
It wasn't an invasive procedure.
No, not at all. No.
It was more consistent with taking what you've just described. It's more consistent with taking.
I tell you what it reminded me of, Andrew. I have heart problems, and I had a cardiac procedure where they put a catheter into your heart and they pump a radioactive liquid into your heart and your valves, and you're lying on the table. And then there's a big arm comes over the top of you with a big round pan on it. Well, that's an X-ray machine.
Yes, yeah.
It goes around you and takes the X-rays of your heart.
Yes.
And it's done almost in real time now. There's 4 television screens next to you, and it's beamed from the control room to the television screen, and the surgeon can look at it, so you can see the X-rays almost in real time. Sure. It reminded me of that kind of thing. I'm not saying it's the same.
Oh, no. And that's why I asked the question. And yeah. You've answered that. That's why I say when they check them out, you would normally say, well, you'll be able to tell. There would be a little bit of residue of the thing which they inject into you. But that's how it shows up on the imagery. Yeah,
there was nothing untoward turned up at their visitation to the hospital. Or at Keesler Air Force Base, there was no radiation. They just went over them with a Geiger counter.
And that's the other thing, Phil, as well, because if they'd been injected with something to make them feel, well, to sedate them effectively, that would also be in their bloodstream.
You would think so, but I'm not a medical professional. I can only relate what they've said to me.
Sure. I just say we understand belief systems and so on and so forth. I mean, that's why it'd be very good to talk to a doctor and say, look, are there circumstances where somebody could be injected with something to sedate them?
Well, here's an interesting thing for you, Andrew. It doesn't refer to this case, but there are other cases who claim that they were taken on board and then they took off. I spoke to my GP many years ago, just my local general practitioner, about this. And he says, do you know, you can tell just by a blood sample, because your blood changes when you've been in weightlessness.
No, absolutely. There you go. That's what I'm saying.
I didn't know that. They don't claim to be weightless, of course, but it's a simple thing. But all I can say is that both men were scared afterwards, more so Calvin. And Charlie said that there were times when I was going through this, I actually fell back on my military training, because he said we were in Korea. One particular time we were under heavy fire, and he thought, my time's come, they're going to kill us, because I couldn't see any way out. We were outnumbered, outgunned. I had my captain with me. My captain said, stay calm, son. The opportunity will come for us to get out of here. So he remembered that and stayed calm during this encounter, because he thought they were going to kill him. That came into his head, but he thought, no, stay calm, son, and the opportunity will come and we'll get out of here. And he said, I didn't see an opportunity, but we still managed to get out.
But does he remember how he got out?
Yeah, these creatures picked him up.
And dropped them.
Took him back out, put him back on the pier, and then departed.
So an easy thing. And they were clothed during all this time?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So none, it was simply they were sedated on a table, on a trolley type thing, and they had images, maybe, that's what they're assuming, images taken of them, but there was no invasive procedure.
Yeah. What is curious about this event, it's the only one that I'm aware of where they've phoned the authorities almost immediately afterwards. First the Air Force Base, and then the Sheriff's Department, and went under interrogation. I mean, it's unheard of. And they've no idea what happened to them. You know, even the sheriff said, I believe these gentlemen. Dr. Hynek, I believe these gentlemen. They had some kind of traumatic experience.
From what you're saying, it is, understandable that they may believe what they are telling people. What I'm interested in, as I say, it goes back to the analogy with your mother and the fairies, is that what we need to do is look at drilling down into, well, okay, if what they're saying is true, what's the evidence to support that bit? Because you've got corroboration, if you like. I'm taking everything at face value, but this is what would happen normally. You've got corroboration from lots of different people saying they saw stuff, including people on the bridge. Yeah, so they saw something, and that's the evidence, the accounts is what you're telling me. It's fairly consistent. So you've got evidence of that. You've got some people who are saying they saw a grey person or a thing, a creature. And so we can look at that sort of evidence. It's the bit in between about the injections and the procedure. That's the bit which is.
Well, I mean, you've been in the legal field. I certainly haven't. I would contend that we could prove, in inverted commas, that something happened to these gentlemen that night, but we couldn't prove what it was. We couldn't prove it was an alien abduction or some kind of psychological manifestation or something else.
Did anybody see then? Did anybody see them being taken?
No, absolutely not.
Okay, so they saw something. So lights. That's what I'm getting. That to me is the critical moment, and it's good to question everything, and we'll dig deeper because you can have a look at that. So for me, what's really helpful is looking at the medical things about injections and why with this advanced technology.
Well, I'll just hold you there because I've forgotten one part of the story.
Yes.
There's two parts actually. I think someone may have seen what happened a bit closer up.
Okay.
It's a lady who used to have a tugboat business down by the river. She won't speak to us.
She'll speak to me. Everybody speaks to me, Philip. She'll speak to me. We get on. What's her name?
The reason we know what she said, she went into a local shop in the town and she spoke to the shop owner, who happened to have a copy of Calvin's book, and she told her what she saw that night.
What's her name?
I'm not going to mention her name on air.
Oh, okay. Tell me after.
Now, I've written to her. I found out she does. It's a real person, and I've spoken to one of her neighbours, and she said she just doesn't want to talk. Okay. Now, I mentioned also when Calvin and Charlie were driving up to the spot, they passed a parked car. In that car was a courting couple. Calvin tells me the story where a few years had gone by, and when he went under hypnosis, he remembered the license plate of this car. Before, he could tell you the make, model, etc., but it's only under hypnosis he remembered the license plate. So he hired a private detective to try and track down who the people were in that car on that night, because they know the date and everything, and he found them. I don't know how long it took him, but he found them. The man who was in the car was deceased, but the lady was now just entered into a nursing home, and Calvin went along and asked if he could see her, and she said, "I'll speak to you on one condition, and that is, you don't give my name out." So he said, "Okay, I'm not." This is a long time before I came on the scene, and she said they saw the UFO take off. And as far as we know, she's still in the nursing home. But even though Calvin and I have become good friends, he won't even tell me her name. That's the kind of gentleman he is. So there is the possibility. I know it's not cast iron, and I've no reason to doubt him, because I've got to know Calvin. He is a very honourable man.
Well, no, I have no doubt. I'm giving him the benefit of the doubt that, as I say, in the same way as you give your mother the benefit of the doubt.
What I'm saying is there could well be others that saw things.
I think it's important, because I know that you've got your book, you've got your screenplay, and so on and so forth. It's important that people do come forward and we can look at this in this forensic way. I think it's a fascinating tale.
Well, I've been speaking to Calvin recently. I'm going to speak to him regularly anyway, Andrew.
Yes.
And for those who are not aware, what happened when the book came out, we got contacted by two film producers, and Calvin signed up with one of them.
Yeah.
And I was still doing the research and so on. So I kept him informed of what was happening. And he had long sessions speaking to Calvin, and he took copious notes. Plus he read the books, he read the archive material I've sent to him. Eventually, we've ended up with a screenplay based on Calvin's encounter. It's about 90% accurate. I've been honoured to be allowed to read it. It's very good, tells a great story, because Calvin's led a colourful life himself outside of all this. He was a bounty hunter at one point.
Oh, brilliant.
And he tells some story about that. He said, I always used to take my gun, Philip. And he said, one night, I didn't take my gun. I don't know why. He said, I took a baseball bat. And he said, the guy I went to arrest took the baseball bat off me and beat the living daylights out of me. So he said, never again do that. That was a mistake. Always take your gun, because they won't argue when the gun's out. So we have a screenplay. And I've said to Calvin, look what happened when you went on local television. All these other people came out of the woodwork. And they've been sat there for decades, never speaking about it. What's going to happen when you finally get either a TV or a cinema movie made of this? Will it bring the rest of them out of the woodwork or not? And he said, well, I hope so. I hope so. But Calvin has been greatly relieved to tell his story at last, Andrew.
I think how old is Calvin?
He's 65 now.
Oh, no, so not too old. I mean, that's a spring
that's
chicken
why,
in current terms. Yes, absolutely.
Well, how it all came about, I mean, unbeknown to me, there was a gentleman in Greece visited the area in 1981. He was in the Greek Merchant Navy, and they docked in Pascagoula. And he was also a UFO researcher. And if you remember, I told you about the police officer who took the calls, and he went back to the police station, and there was a clergyman there reporting it. Well, my colleague, Stephanos, in Greece, interviewed that clergyman.
Okay.
And he was introduced to him because the clergyman was of Greek descent.
Right.
And he too, along with other colleagues, saw the UFO. They were actually chairing an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting that night, and they were on the way to it, on the motorway, when this thing went across the road in front of them. So when Stephanos contacted me and told me this, I thought, well, I think we've got a pretty good chance that others might come forward. But we were amazed at those that did and the amount of them. And of course, what we talked before about not looking at things in isolation.
Yes.
So we take a greater look at what else was happening in the United States at that point in time. And there was a huge wave of UFO sightings right across America in 1973, Andrew. Probably the biggest wave of UFO sightings anywhere. And the Pascagoula event was right in the middle of it. So there were other accounts, all different kinds of things from right across the country. There's even a huge, great report about it, done sometime afterwards. I work with a lady by the name of Dr. Irina Scott. She lives in Ohio. And you'll never believe this, Philip, but on the night in question, October the 11th, 1973, my mother lived 600 miles away. She phones me. She says there's been a huge sonic boom in the area. And that sonic boom went across half of the United States. So Dr. Scott's been looking into this sonic boom. For example, she said, if it's an aircraft that makes a sonic boom, normally the noise can only be heard for about 2 or 3 miles distance. And she said, this is whatever caused this sonic boom was the biggest bang since Krakatoa, which was the island volcano that blew up in 18 naught blob. And so there were other things happening as well. So Dr. Scott's looking into that, and she'll be published. Well, I'll be publishing her findings next year. Okay. So again, we don't look at it in isolation.
Well, no, I think absolutely not. And that's why we love all this sort of information, which is great. So just to put this in context, I mean, have there been many other alien abductions or alleged alien abductions?
Lots of them. I mean, there's lots of famous ones. I mean, what Calvin did, he got the opportunity to go meet, probably one of the most famous was a lady by the name of Betty Hill. Her and her husband, Barney, in 1961 were traveling home from Canada. When they had, it wasn't the first alien abduction encounter, but it was the first one that hit the headlines. It was a couple of years later. They went through regressive hypnosis with a chap called Dr. Benjamin Simon, and eventually it was released to the media. So Calvin had the opportunity to meet Betty Hill. Barney had died at this point, and he went and stayed with her for a couple of days. And he said she was a lovely woman, But I was looking for answers and she couldn't give me any. You know, her encounter was totally different to what we'd experienced, but it was grateful to meet her. And then, of course, a couple of years after Charlie and Calvin, you have Travis Walton and his colleagues in Sitgreaves National Park, bunch of loggers driving home one night through the forest. They stop by this clearing and there's this thing hovering there. So Travis gets out, stands underneath it, and he's hit by a beam, knocks him sideways. The rest of the guys take off. But they go back to try and find him and he's gone. And Travis Walton was gone for 5 days. They launched a huge manhunt looking for him. His 5 colleagues were accused almost of murdering him. They all took polygraphs and passed. And then 5 days later, he turned up at a petrol station, naked, no clothes on, in a phone booth, phoned his brother, and they went and picked him up. He thought he'd been gone 15 minutes. He'd been gone for 5 days. He had 5 days worth of growth on his face. He was dehydrated. He was hungry. He was hospitalized. That was made into a movie called Fire in the Sky. Rather ironically, I was hired here in the UK to promote that film when it came out.
And did he have, in that instance, does he have a consistent description of the people who abducted him?
Well, yeah, I mean, what Travis thought this only happened for a few minutes. He had no idea when they found him that 5 days had gone by.
Right.
And he said he came around, he felt he was in some kind of enclosure, scared out of his wits.
Yeah.
And thought, I'm going to get the hell out of here. So he takes a walk through. He came across these humanoid beings. They had an orangey red jumpsuit on, for want of a better word, round head, grey features. And there was a table there, and they startled him. And there was something on this table, so he picked it up and he tried to hit them. You know, he was trying to defend himself. They scarpered. So he wanders around this other part of this thing, and he comes into another, I'll call it a room, and there are what you would call human-looking beings. The only difference is they have remember the sort of 1950s goldfish bowl space helmet on their heads, and they were there with these very blue eyes. And that's it. That's all he can remember, pretty much. And he's back on the road.
Does he remember having an infection?
No.
And the character, you mentioned beforehand that the grey characters that your people saw by the lake, they were the first time they've ever been described in that sort of way.
Absolutely. What I'm saying is,
sort of characters different. They could be from a different planet, possibly, or they could just be.
We can speculate for hours what may or may not be.
Yeah.
The point is, we cannot find it anywhere else in the literature. So
sure.
It's not as if they're confabulating what somebody else has seen or they've heard on the TV.
But as you said beforehand, with the example about your spaceship, you put that up for 45 seconds. People draw different things. The description that they had was different. They could be different entities. Some of them had a suit on, so they need to wear that particular side, so they need to help with breathing or something. But in that instance, in the one where he was gone for 5 days, does he recall what procedures were carried out on him? Or you talked about last time, or he doesn't recall any of it?
No, but just those little moments that I've explained. That's why he thought this had only happened for a few minutes.
Right.
And he was astounded when they picked him up. They told him he'd been missing for 5 days.
I mean, it's fascinating stuff, and it's always when there are certain questions unanswered that people fill in the blanks, and that's always happens, isn't it?
Yeah.
To make it think. You look at these a lot, and you go through your normal question things. What do you, Philip Mantle, think happened?
Well, that's a great question, Andrew. I mean, my first book back in 1994 was called Without Consent. I've republished it recently, so it's updated to a revised edition, but it deals with abductions and missing time cases in the UK only, nowhere else, just the UK. Back in the day, I literally did get in the car and drive from one end of the country to the other and interview as many people as I could in person. And there is no one thing you can say, this definitely happened or that happened. What you can say is that these are ordinary, everyday members of Joe public about their daily tasks. One lady with her daughter picking wildflowers in a field behind her house. Another chap, a painter and decorator, on the way to visit his fiancée. Young man in Wales, unemployed, walking home from his friends late one night. You know, just your ordinary everyday Joe, when something extraordinary happens to him. So what I did after I published Without Consent, I wrote to a number of these witnesses, and I said, I want your opinion of what happened to you. So, okay, what do you think happened? And there were a few who said, yeah, definitely, we think we've been abducted by some kind of alien from wherever. A couple more thought, no, this is some kind of spiritual experience. Don't ask me what, you know, spiritual is, because it means different things to different people. A few more said, I've no idea, Philip. We were hoping you could tell us. So even the people themselves that have these experiences, there is nothing that binds them together that said they're all leading towards this. It's usually, as we talked about before, confirmation bias. It's usually the UFO researchers who try and funnel these experiences into one category or another. All I will say is that these people, in my opinion, have had some kind of anomalous event that as yet we cannot explain. And I'll leave it at that. I see my job sometimes as a UFO investigator, Andrew, as a chap who is just documenting this information that hopefully then somebody somewhere at some time will be able to make sense of it all. It's like the early astronomers. They would record data and their assumptions were totally wrong. But nonetheless, they recorded it. And it was only as the technology and the science caught up with them, then we could say, well, they were actually witnessing this. This is what they were seeing. They thought it was something completely different. However, we now know it was this.
In the same way as people may get frozen, cryotherapy or cryogenics, where you'll get frozen and hope that somebody will find a cure for whatever disease you might have sometime in the future. So, so it's gathering that information, it's keeping an open mind, it's turning around, as I say, it's drilling down the bit which, as I say, which I'm particularly interested in, is that moment where we're looking for that additional evidence, because we're filling in the blanks at the moment. So people see things in all these stories, people see things, and then the people themselves who are part of the story, they genuinely believe something has happened. I get that, but they genuinely believe it. What we need to look at, and that's the bit we need to drill out, what might have happened and why. And that's where we need to look a little bit more, and we can carry on exploring these sort of things, which I think is brilliant. But for now, Philip, it's been absolutely brilliant as always to have you here. Tell us what we'll continue looking at this story, we'll continue getting the evidence, we'll continue maybe get some of the people that you spoke about, get them on the show as well and talk to them as well. What are we going to look at in the next episode? Well, who knows, maybe you'll have Calvin Parker himself and speak to him direct. That would be brilliant, because he's more than willing to go on the record. And what is again curious, Calvin in his 2 books still doesn't come to any conclusion. He says, I'm still looking for the answers. Well, maybe we can help find that answer. We like starting, and the road to the answer is by starting questioning everything, and that's certainly what we do on this program. It is Philip, indeed. A real joy. Thank you very much indeed for joining me. It's been fascinating as always. My pleasure, Andrew. Thank you. Take care. Bye-bye.